right. I think this is going to be a good one. Captain America 160. I went into this with low expectations. I remember it being mediocre or maybe even weak. But I think maybe every other time that I have read it, it has been when I have been going through the rest of the run. And honestly, I cannot implore enough that people just read issues. Pick out a random issue, get a trade out, read one issue by itself. Issues deserve your attention. Until about 2001, comics were made to be consumed that way, not as stories or as runs, but single issues. This one is the first appearance and the introduction of a new villain, Solarr. There is some interesting things about him, but this issue is by Steve Englehart and the dead John Buscema, dead brother of the dead Sal Buscema. This is how I acknowledge the passing of one of the greats. Steve Englehart is still alive and still claiming every new Batman thing is ripping off his unpublished Batman story from 2006. We have some important background to cover though, some important history. Captain America has superpowers. Well, he has actual superhuman strength now, rather than peak human strength. This came about because he was poisoned by Viper. We will strangely be coming back to Viper for another reason later in the video. But the antidote to the poison that Captain America took interacted with his super soldier syrup, and the result was he got these powers. Behind the scenes, the real reason for it was probably because Captain America just wasn't working. It wasn't popular. The series, it was one of Marvel's worst sellers. To Steve Englehart's credit, he turns that around, but we're still quite early on in his run. He had kicked off with an impressive story that did land well with people reading the book, but by about a year, things will have improved for the series. And as much as I don't like Steve Englehart 85% of the time, he single-handedly saved Captain America. And there's a good chance Captain America could have gone the way of Quasar or Captain Marvel's, the real one, Marvel, if it weren't for this run re-energizing Captain America to staggering degrees. The super strength is an angle I don't like, and this issue is entirely about it too. That is why I had to explain it up front. Here, Captain America and Falcon Man, they are dealing with some diamond thieves. If only they put the effort into thieving diamonds that they put into costuming, they might have gotten away with this if they did. Now here you can see Captain America ripping the door off of an armoured truck. That is how strong he is now. His super strength won't last. It ends up being forgotten about and slowly phased out in this very run. But right now, Captain America must know how Thor feels. One thing we are doing is a subplot with Falcon Man. feeling unneeded and especially useless now that Cap has actual superpowers. I know I point this out every fucking time, but this is before he had wings. I really cannot understand how this character went on for so long, and it took Steve Englehart to go halfway into his run as well. Why don't we give him wings? It's like the most obvious thing ever. And I will also give Steve Englehart this. He did do a lot to make Falcon Man a proper character. I think Steve Englehart maybe even deserves the credit for making it so that Falcon Man wasn't just a sidekick anymore. His run on Captain America features, or should I say, his run on Captain America and Falcon Man, that is what it is titled. He was always very good at having Falcon Man receive attention, but also having Falcon Man's parts be their own thing, without frequent overlap with Captain America entering his world too much. Steve Englehart did a lot of good stuff for Falcon Man, and then he went and spoiled it all by doing something stupid like revealing he was a drug dealing pimp. I ate the stuff before Steve Englehart. I'll put that out there. Completely directionless. Falcon Man definitely was part of the problem. Not so much in him. They didn't know what to do with him. Well, they didn't know what to do with Captain America either. It was around about this time when they were thinking about revamping Captain America as a super spy, as like a male Scarlett Johansson. But Falcon Man, it came across like they were keeping him around because they felt that they had to. And he didn't have wings. Falcon Man, without wings, is as pointless as he feels in this issue. Overall, the stories were poor. I wouldn't lay the blame at Falcon Man's feet. The book was going through a major drought of almost everything needed to make a comic title good. Actually, I'd say the problem was that Captain America himself was boring. He felt unrequired. Falcon Man felt like a better lead character than he did. Now, though, we are introduced to Solarr, a long-haired hippie twat with flame powers and a headband with a gem on it. Solarr is an intriguing villain because I would argue he is a decently recognisable one. You, maybe, haven't even read a story with him in, but for whatever reason, you recognise Solarr. So here he is robbing the stock exchange. And what I think people might say is that Solarr is an incredibly generic villain. He does meet the Gary Conman criteria of having absolutely zero connection to the hero who he is fighting, Captain America, which is why he doesn't ever appear in Captain America series ever again, but instead he shows up in a wide range of other books. Solarr, however, serves a purpose. He isn't meant to be the new Captain America villain. He is meant to be a super villain that Captain America can defeat with his new super strength. When you look at it through that perspective, Solarr having such basic powers and vague motivation, it's okay. Solarr is there to showcase Captain America's new powers. After this, Solarr seems to put in many appearances over the years. He teams up with Andy Serkis over in Steve Englehарт's Avengers. That is his second appearance. He fights the Defenders. Where I probably know him most is from Marky Mark J comics. He was a prisoner being held at Project Cadmus, and we nearly always got a cameo appearance or a mention of him whenever we featured Project Cadmus. I think what maybe also makes him so familiar is that he was in an episode of Excellent Men the Animated Series. Solarr is completely fine as a villain. A generic, recognisable fire thug. He even survived Scourge. But then Proust killed him off like a year later. Waste of a perfectly useful villain character. Godman is working at Project Cadmus in that too. Didn't know about that appearance. Maybe you saw this one coming, but yes, Solarr did appear in Thunderbals at one point. He was on the Nazi Thunderbals team with the original Baron Zero, the original Moonstump, Iron Cross, Ion from C3PO 15, and Makeshift from the first Deadpool's miniseries. I am possibly overinflating Solarr's legends, so let me know if it's the same with you. You know this villain, you recognise him. He feels like a classic, well-known B-tier villain to you. I don't know what it is that makes him stand out in that manner. You can count his appearances with your fingers, but Solarr feels like a notable villain when he is objectively not. The most wild part of Solarr is his origin. There is no credit for him, but this was Steve Gerber. This origin was Steve Gerber. It was based on an idea Steve Gerber had. Well, it's based on an LSD trip Steve Gerber had. But there's also some cribbing going on from a separate reality by Carlos Castaneda. What we have is a hippie, his minivan broke down in the desert, and he wandered trying to find help, but days went by and he eventually collapsed under the sun. And yet he was reborn with fire powers, and now believes himself to be the sun's devout acolyte. He thinks he is the son of the sun. He went nuts in the heat, or there's also the possibility that none of that happened, and he just had a bad trip like Steve Gerber did. Vipper was also Steve Gerber. At least the idea that he worked in advertising. And you might notice a lot of crossover between Steve Englehart, Steve Gerber, and Jim Starman. Like Moongarden having an arbitrary interlude by Jim Starman in a Steve Gerber issue of Daredevil, or Jim Starman redrawn Smurf's face throughout Avengers 137. The reason is that the three of them are red, shared an apartment at the time. Mike Ghost Driver, no relation to Gary, he was there originally too. And for a month or two, Kenny Everett lived there. It all makes sense when you know this. That's why Moongarden is in a Mike Ghost Driver issue of Iron Man, despite it being a Jim Starman character based on his then-girlfriend. That's why you often see Mike Ghost Driver helping out with Jim Starman's early writing, or even, later in the series, Steve Englehart's writing. That is why Steve Englehart writes with Jim Starman for a few issues of Captain Marvel's, the real one, Marvel. That is why Jim Starman is doing random art to help out on Avengers. That's why we have a crossover between Steve Gerber's Daredevil and Steve Englehart's Avengers. Same with Jim Starman's Captain Marvel's, the real one, Marvel, and Steve Englehart's Avengers. And then, that is why in Steve Englehart's Captain America, we have two villains that are co-created by Steve Gerber. When it comes down to it, Solarr isn't that far removed from Scream, is he? Now though, we are on to the fight. Captain America versus Solarr. I reckon a lot of people loved seeing Captain America beat on a hippie. I think people might write this issue off as a simple hero versus new villain issue. And they don't observe that it is happening to showcase the title star's new strength. Now, don't get me wrong, that's becoming a bit of a catchphrase at this point. Don't get me wrong, this is very generic stuff, but that it has a purpose is raising it above an issue like the one where he fights the man brute. Solarr is better than that, easily. Solarr is credible. That was the word I was fishing around in my brain for. He feels like a credible villain somehow. He has a weird origin, which is improved with the idea that it may never have happened. And he has very basic but typically powerful abilities. For what this issue needed, he could have been as shit as Man Brute. But there's quirks to Solarr. Quirks that speak to creativity rather than necessity. The most compelling part is that we don't resolve Falcon Man's feelings of inadequacy. We re-emphasise the point that he isn't needed. Captain America He is able to defeat Solarr all by himself with a can of paint. Of course, Captain America, he isn't full of himself. He knows that this has put a distance between him and his partner, and he wants to try and talk it through with Falcon Man. We end with a lead-in to my tied least favourite story of Steve Englehardt's Captain America. Every now and then, I think about trying to collect the rest of the run, and I remember that story, and I realise I don't want that. This one is definitely a weird issue. I kinda dig it, which is also how a hippie twat would phrase it. I like that we have a straightforward idea, but there are parts of it that are trying to go beyond that. I never felt like Steve Englehart was ever wasting my time with this comic. He was doing a story that felt obligatory, but he tried to insert some personality or idea into it to make it less run-of-the-mill. I'll give it 7 thumbs up, and I didn't even mention Willow once.